University College Dublin with Remember That One Time.
Thank you. Thanks. So I didn't exactly follow the brief. I mean, I sort of did, but not as much as other people maybe. So this is less about contradiction than perhaps some of the other papers. But it's a consequence of MacTaggart. So I'll explain. So as we know, MacTaggart famously argued that there is no time. We had a lovely paper this morning on that very topic. And even if we don't agree with MacTaggart about that, we might think that there could have been no time. So, of course, it would follow directly from MacTaggart's argument that there could have been no time since there wouldn't be any. But even if we think there is time, we might think there could have failed to be time. And there are various things. I like this thought because I liked thinking about this because different people's reactions to this thought really bring out their presuppositions about what time is, what a moment of time is, whether they're thinking of time as a physical phenomenon or whether they're thinking of time as a metaphysical phenomenon. And so I think it generates some very nice thought and discussion. And in this paper, I'm going to first quickly set out some general kind of theses that people in the philosophy of time tend to accept or reject, which help to situate their reaction to the question of whether there could have been no time. And then I'm going to describe an argument for the conclusion that there has to be time. So not only is it not true that there could have failed to be time, but no matter how things had turned out, there would have been time. So that's quite a surprising conclusion, I think, because most people don't have that sense. I'm not exactly defending the argument, more just exploring different ways in which one might react to it, different presuppositions one might have about time that make it more or less attractive to one. So there are people who will strongly dislike the argument, there are people who will feel more sympathetic to it, and I think that brings out some of the things we think about time. The argument will be especially appealing to philosophers who don't think of time as primarily a physical phenomenon. And that's one of the things that I think makes it interesting. So, as a bit of background, MacTaggart, as we know, argued that since events and times must either form an A series or a B series, and that they can't consistently form an A series, and if they form a B series, he says nothing changes, he concludes on that basis that time is unreal, which is a strange way of saying that there is no time, but saying there is no time is a strange thing to say as well. So you can see why he put it in those terms. So I'm just going to call that thesis Atemporality, the view that there's no time. That's the conclusion that MacTaggart argues for, and Temporality, the conclusion or the view that there is time. Now this immediately raises a question: what do we mean when we say there is or there isn't time? In general, we don't mean, we're certainly not using time as a name for a thing, right? that either is or isn't around somewhere. It's a phenomenon or a structure or something like that, right? It's not an object. But we might at least, even if we don't have the grand ambition to answer the question of, in a meaningful and fully satisfying way, of what time is, we might think we can at least characterize a relationship between time and something else that'll sort of help us to understand whether time is around or not. And MacTaggart gives us a hint in this direction when he says he supposes that it would be universally admitted that time involves change. He goes on, a universe in which nothing whatever changed would be a timeless universe, right? This is one of the premises of his argument against the A series. So he thinks, it sounds like he thinks time requires change. Now, one may wonder about how one ought to interpret MacTaggart in particular on this question. Maybe he's talking about concepts. Maybe he's not thinking of, well, one might think he's not thinking of metaphysical possibilities and necessities, but it's natural to draw from this in a sort of contemporary framework the idea that there must be change for there to be time. That time strictly requires change. So we'll call that, I'll call that time is change. Necessarily, metaphysically necessarily, there's time just in case there is change. Because after all, if we agree that time strictly requires change, it seems even more plausible that change strictly requires time. You can't have change without time. Right? If we really mean change, and we say something is changing, we must think there is some time as well. So since time really plausibly strictly requires, since change really plausibly strictly requires time, if we grant McTaggart that time also strictly requires change, we have a relationship going in both directions. We have a hypothesis that time really is just change. As I say, it doesn't fully answer the question of what time is or what change is. It just gives you a relationship. Right? So then we could start worrying about what change consists in. Very briefly, as we know, this isn't really crucially important to what I'm going to say and what follows, that there are these views in the philosophy of time inherited from McTaggart's distinction between the A and B series, called the A theory and the B theory, and I'm going to put them like this. There are many different ways of, many different incompatible ways of stating these views. I don't offer these as interpretations of the literature. I'm using the names A and B theory for these two theses. Two views one might have, that there is an absolute distinction between present and non-present times, that the distinction isn't, in other words, merely relative to, say, a position in time, and the view that there is no such absolute distinction. So if one were following the physics, very strictly the interpretation of the physics that you spoke about earlier, one would say, well, the A theory can't be true, because the A theory, as it sounds, if we think of times as a series of, a foliation of space-time, say, a given foliation of space-time, we're going to say, no, there isn't an absolute distinction between one and the others of these, such that the rest are, such that that one is uniquely the present. What's important for this question is, because of this disagreement, persisting disagreement between so-called A and B theorists, there's a disagreement about what change consists in. A theorists tend to think that change requires there to be change in what's true, and that's how I'm going to understand, that's how one might understand the A-theoretic conception of change. So if you believe that there's an absolute distinction between the present time and non-present times, naturally you'll think that that's a changing matter as to which time is absolutely present, and so naturally you'll want to think there are facts that really do change. Right? The fact that this moment is the present can't always be true, so it's a changing fact. And we can express that by saying, look, it's the view that some truths are sometimes, some claims or some propositions are sometimes true and sometimes false. Right? It's not the case that every truth is always true. In contrast, many people who are attracted to the B-theoretic view, the view that is often expressed as the view that aligns, the philosophical view that aligns best with the straightforward interpretation of space-time physics, will say that change is just essentially variation across the temporal dimension. Right? As long as there are differences along the temporal dimension, we have change. So you can put it like this: there's change just in case there are properties of times that are possessed by some but not all times. And if you were being very strict to the relativity of simultaneity, then you would say time here is context sensitive, and that its variation along whichever foliation of space-time is the relevant to your particular trajectory through space-time, your particular location. Okay. So the question is, can we express something that seems general to those two apparently different views of change? Can we say something about change that doesn't tie us to that particular disagreement in the philosophy of time. And my suggestion is that we could say, for example, that change consists in there being at least two times, one of which is before the other. Right? Because you might think on any view, whether you were an A theorist or a B theorist, if you think there are at least two times, one of which is before the other, at least two times standing in a temporal relation, you've got to think that either a truth has gone from true to false, or false to true, as on the A theory, there'll have to be some kind of change of that type, or you're going to think there's going to be some difference between those times, such that there's a property possessed by one and not the other, and of course that'll have to be true. I mean, one time is itself and not the other time, for example, right? So there'll have to be some difference between the two times, such there have to be some kind of variation, even if the times were otherwise empty, there would be some variation between the times. So I suggest that we have a sense, probably more than one, of what change is, despite the position we might take on the disagreement between the A theory and the B theory. But then the question is, should we accept that this view that time requires change, time is change effectively, the view that I've called time is change? And I don't think we should. I think there's good reason to think that less is required for there to be time than that there is change. So imagine we found out, for example, that nothing could have been otherwise. We find out that the reality we live in is one where there's only one way things can go, in the broadest sense of, the strongest sense of can, you like. The world is perfectly deterministic, and moreover, the laws are the only laws there could have been, for example, so that there's really no other way things could go, except the way they go. In that case, you'd say, well, look, everything that's true has to be true. Everything that's true is necessarily true. There's only one, as philosophers might put it, there's only one possible world. Right? The actual world is the only possible world. Nothing is contingent. Right? Nothing could have been otherwise. It's not a completely unimaginable situation. But we wouldn't want to say, I think, in that case, that there's no modality. There would still be modal truths, right? The fact that everything must be the way it is itself a modal truth. It's a truth about how things are. A truth about how things could be. In other words, the truth about how things could be is that they couldn't be any other way, right? But we would find out that we'd lived in a particular kind of modal world. It's a world where everything must be the way it is. And similarly, I think we should say the same for the temporal case. We can imagine a situation where nothing changes, where or at least we can imagine a situation where, not where everything changes, where everything that's true is always true. I'm anticipating this. Right? That everything that's true is always true. A situation in which every truth is eternal. In that case, we might say there's only one time. Right? So imagine a world that only exists for a moment. That might be the most natural, right? Just a little world where everything exists only for a moment. Should we say that's a world without time? Or should we say it's just, as in the modal case, a world where we find out, as it were, once we live in that world, which isn't very interesting, because we're in there for a moment, we find out that everything is always the case. It's an eternal world. Okay. So if that's right, if the temporal case is analogous, if we can imagine a situation in which everything that's true is always true, in which there's only one moment of time, I think we're imagining a situation in which there is time at the limit. There's a single moment of time, everything that's true is always true, but there's no change. And I would suggest that on that basis, if you accept that possibility, then you can say that time isn't the same as change. This is the case of time without change. So I quite like a less demanding sense of the requirement for there to be time. I'm going to assume that there's time just in case there's at least one moment of time. Right, so as long as there's a moment of time, you've got time. Now, whether we agree on a situation Whether we agree as to whether there is a moment of time in a particular situation, of course, is another matter. But if we grant on whatever particular view of time we have that there's a moment of time, then I'm going to say we should allow that that's a situation in which there is time. It doesn't really, I've spent a lot of time on this, it doesn't really actually matter too much. I think the argument that I'm going to describe in a moment is more interesting if we think that the presence of a time is sufficient for there to be time in general. But if you don't agree and you think, no, that's not enough, there being a time isn't sufficient for there to be time, then you can just read the argument as an argument for the claim that there must be a time. And then you can deny that that entails that there's time at all. Okay, so I think it's a weird thing to say. Oh, there's a time. There could be a situation in which there's a time but no time, but that's fine. I mean, that's the view you could take. Okay. So I think the argument's still interesting. We've had a nice background on this, which I think I can kind of skip a little bit, on the idea that there could be no time at all. Barber's view, which was mentioned this morning, I rely on Jeremy Butterfield's very clear philosophical exposition of the view that Barber describes in his book, The End of Time, as a genuinely timeless theory of the world. So not simply one, as Barber puts it, where time doesn't feature in the fundamental equations of physics, but one where we rightly say, taking everything else into account, this is not, there is no time. There's often a bit of uncertainty when you read physicists on time, on the philosophical implications of physics, as to whether when they say there's no time, as you know from your own work, whether they mean that there's no time fundamentally or whether there's no time at all. There's no basis for time in the world. Carlo Rovelli, for example, has a very confusing chapter in one of his books called Time Does Not Exist, in which he then goes on to say, of course time exists. It's just not what you thought it was, which is not a good way of putting it. But that's an argument for physics for atemporality. In other words, if Butterfield is right, then Barber is arguing for the same thesis that McTaggart is. Now, it implies that there could be no time, but only by establishing, as he sees it, the strong view that there is no time. But we also have a excellent recent book by Baron, Miller and Talent on timelessness, in which they argue that time might not exist. And in particular, they give us this argument, they defend this argument. There are live physical theories, by which they mean theories such as loop quantum gravity, which are attempts, as we saw this morning, to combine the general theory of relativity with standard model of particle physics, quantum theory. There are live physical theories that eliminate the C series, where the C series here is, it's a bit difficult to say what the C series exactly is, but we can think of the C series in the way that Fabrice mentioned this morning as an ordering of times that is not an ordering of precedence between times. Right? So there's there are times and temporal relations between them, but they are not directed. Right? They don't have a preferred forwards or backwards direction. And they conclude from the fact that there are such physical theories that the elimination of the C series, which is for them, I think, right to say the elimination of time, is at least an epistemic possibility. In other words, for all we know, there might be no time, based on the current physics. Now, of course, it could be that for all we know, there's no time, but there must be time. But one can see very easily how you can get from that kind of conclusion to the thought that there could be no time. Okay, so it gives us some reason for. And there are other kinds of arguments you might consider in favor of. So one reason you might be sympathetic to the possibility of there being no time is that current physics tends, you might think, in that direction, either because you accept Barber's interpretation or because you accept the sort of interpretation, philosophical interpretation that the authors of the previous book have spoken about, or that you've spoken about in your work, right? There's a lot of excellent philosophical work on how we should think about theories like quantum loop gravity. But there are also kind of general philosophical reasons. So if you're a person who thinks of moments of time as physical things, say, regions of space-time that's been foliated appropriately, perhaps relative to a trajectory or a position, you might think, look, the physics of the world could have been such that there's nothing of this physical kind, right? If you think of times as slices of space-time, you might think the physics could have gone so that there's no way to foliate space-time in a way that gives you what looks like anything that'll play the time role. Right? Or you might think that the physics of the world could have been so messy that there was nothing that would give you the basis for a relationship of precedence between ways of foliating the manifold. So if you're sufficiently creative in the possibilities you can imagine for physical space, for the physics of the world, then you might be able to think of ways in which whatever you think of as times just couldn't have either existed or couldn't have played the role that they're supposed to play if they are times. If you want to be a little more creative, you could think, well, look, in general, you might think there could have never been anything concrete. We could have lived in a non-physical world, whatever that means exactly. Right? If you're the sort of person who accepts relatively wild possibilities as genuine possibilities, you might think there could have been no physical world. And you might think if there were no physical world, there would have been no time. Again, this will more or less go for people who think of time as a physical phenomenon. But there's also a kind of argument that I think attracts not just people who think of time as a physical thing, but also people who think of time as more in the way that some atheists do, as a sort of metaphysical phenomenon. You might think the world could have been purely mathematical. We could have lived in a world where the only truths were mathematical truths, and the truth that the only truths are mathematical truths. I won't worry about that too much. The only interesting truths are mathematical truths, and then there's all the truths about the fact that all the truths are mathematical truths, and other things. However you want to present a purely mathematical world. And you might think, look, if the world were just maths, if reality was just maths, then there would be no time. I mean, that strikes many people as, if they're willing to grant a possibility, it strikes many people as obvious in some way, right? If the world was just maths, there would be no time. I mean, it's not that obvious necessarily, but it strikes some people as obvious. Okay, maybe the world is just maths. Maybe there is no time. Okay. So there are different ways to get to this thesis. I think it's a reasonable sounding thesis. However, and I'll finish in the next 10 minutes, there's also an argument for thinking it's false, and in fact that there has to be time. Or at least that there has to be one time. That there has to be at least one time. There has to be a time. Right? And I conclude from this that there has to be time, but you may not like that inference. You may disagree with that inference. I don't think much rests on it. Maybe it does. I don't know. I'm interested. So the argument is, I've sent everyone the handout by email. Sorry, I should have said that ages ago. Just before I started speaking, I sent everyone on the mailing list. Or everyone who was on the mailing list. Though maybe not everyone. Sorry, maybe only a select few. That's even worse than sending nothing. It was just whoever was on Vincent's. Sorry, yeah. So it should be some of the attendees anyway, at least. But maybe nothing is better than creating it's like the Stanford prison experiment or something. You'll all hate each other now. Okay, so the argument is a bit technical looking, but it can be read very straightforwardly in English, and it's a very simple argument. It's an argument that relies on very general, what you might call logical or metaphysical hypotheses about time. And as I say, none of them are massively controversial or or complicated. And in fact, there are only really 4 assumptions and then 2, a sub-conclusion and a final conclusion. So I'm going to talk about the argument. So the first premise says, necessarily, for any truth proposition claim P, for it to be that sometimes P is for there to be a time at which P. In other words, very shortly, in very simple language, for something to be sometimes true is for there to be a time at which it's true, right? That they mean the same thing. To say sometimes Dan is happy is to say sometime, say there is a time at which Dan is happy. And that's something that seems very plausible to many people. How could something sometimes be true, but there be no time at which it's true? That sounds very odd. Or how could something never be true, but also there be some time at which it's true? Right? Those are the things you're denying when you accept this premise, and they seem like reasonable things. Okay. Second premise. So this says, necessarily, if something is always the case, then it's the case. So what's always true is true. Again, it seems so obvious as to be hardly worth denying. If you say Dan is always happy, then it straightforwardly follows that Dan is happy. If you say it's always the case that 2 and 2 makes 4, then you can't well deny that 2 and 2 makes 4. Okay? And this is just like the claim that what must be true is true, which also seems like a piece of common sense. To deny it would be to think that something could always be the case, but not be the case. Or, assuming a certain equivalence between sometimes and always, that something could be true but never true. Right? It sounds a bit less weird, but still a bit weird. Okay. Now, there is, as some of you will know, a reason why, despite this sounding very obvious, philosophers have denied it, and that's that it causes trouble for a certain kind of view in the philosophy of time. And the worry is something like this: if you think there are many moments of time, and you accept that premise too, that what's always true is true, and you think that always and sometimes can be intertranslated, that what's always true is what's not sometimes false, right? Say always Dan is happy, say it's not sometimes the case that Dan isn't happy. Then you can get out the claim that what's sometimes true is true. Right? So they turn out to be equivalent. What's always true is true. Sorry, what's true is sometimes true. Right? They're equivalent. What's always true is true. What's true is sometimes true. And this is thought to be quite controversial for certain views, because if you think there are many moments of time, and you think that what's true is sometimes true, you get the conclusion that sometimes there are many moments of time. And if in addition you think that to say sometimes there are f's, where f is some property or other, that there's a time at which many f's are located, you get the contradictory conclusion that there's a time at which many times are located, and that sounds bizarre. So you've got to deny something from this set 1 to 6, and some philosophers think that the culprit is in fact the assumption here. Right? In other words, what they're going to say is, I believe there are many moments of time, but I don't think it's always true that there are many moments of time, or it's sometimes true that there are many moments of time. When I'm speaking sub specie aeternitatis, I'm looking from outside, I'm talking about time from outside, and I don't say always and sometimes when I'm talking about time from that perspective. Right? It's not appropriate. So they'll think this is false when the truth in question is a truth about time from outside of time. Right? That it's somehow inappropriate, that this principle really is only appropriate to certain kinds of truths. Truths that are truths about how things are from within time. Right? That's the kind of view. So Kit Fine has famously, I suppose, expressed this kind of distinction, and he says in a paper in his Untitled Chapter in 2005, that some truths, some claims, some truths, we'll look at truths, like that 2 and 2 is 4, the mathematical truth, or that my dog Clodagh is a dog, because she's essentially a dog, right? She couldn't be without being a dog. Kip Fine says that such truths are eternal, and by that he means that they just can't possess properties like being true at a time, or being sometimes true, or being always true. Right? They are of a different kind to the kinds of truths that can possess those properties. And he says, look, in fact, we should think of them as being true of times. Where to say that something is true of a time is just to say it's true no matter how things are at that time, right? Its truth doesn't care for the contents of time in any respect. And of course, what he's doing by saying this is setting up a kind of distinction that isn't intrinsic to the notion of truth at a time normally, which is that truth at a time, for something to be true at a time, is for its truth to, it's for its content, it's for what it says to somehow care about what's happening at that time. You know, Dan is happy at this moment because the truth that Dan is happy is a truth that intrinsically somehow cares about what's going on within time. Whereas truths like 2 and 2 plus 4 and Clodagh is a dog, what they're about does not care about what's happening within time, right, in some sense. Now it's a distinction that Fine says is natural and intuitive. Whether we accept it is another question. And of course these kinds of eternal propositions will be true of either every time or no time. 2 and 2 makes 5 is true of no time. And what's interesting about Fine's view is that it's compatible with both the A and the B theory, including versions of the A theory on which time is a kind of metaphysical phenomenon. Right? So we saw previously that, I said, I mean, it wasn't so obvious maybe, but the arguments for possible atemporality, the arguments for thinking that there could be no time, tend to be more attractive to philosophers who think of time as a physical phenomenon, because they're more willing to think, well, look, the world could have been such, the physical world could have been such that there's nothing physical to play the role of time, or there could have been nothing physical at all, and so nothing fit to play the role of time. Now, if you're the kind of person, the kind of philosopher of time who doesn't think of moments of time themselves as physical things, you think of them rather as, say, representations that can be true or false, stories about how the world would be at a moment if that moment were present, right? Complete stories about the world as it would be at that moment if that moment were present. If you think of time like that, worries about the physical nature of the world, worries about the interpretation of quantum loop gravity might not be so much. Philosophical interpretations of physics, such as Barber's, for example, might not attract you so obviously to the conclusion that there could fail to be time. But if you are so attracted, or, for example, you think that, if you're the kind of person who thinks, well, the world could have been purely mathematical, and if it were, or if you say it was just arithmetic, or something, I don't know. I mean, that's not a real possibility, but, you can imagine it somehow. Maybe. I can imagine the world being such that there's no time, despite my commitment to despite my view of how time works, that's in a non-physical way. You can still use Fine's distinction to explain what's happening there, right? You can be an atheist who says the only truths could have been eternal truths in Fine's sense, right? They could have been the only truths there are. And that doesn't seem contradictory. Okay. One final point. One tiny point.
We started a bit late.
Oh, we started a bit late. Okay, I wondered why. Okay, thanks. Okay, good. So I won't go too long. So, should we agree with Fine that there are such eternal propositions? So, the kind of case against, other than commitment to the B theory and the necessity of avoiding the conclusion of the argument I mentioned earlier, the contradictory conclusion of the argument that there's a time at which many times are located, is the kind of case of the weirdness, or many philosophers think it sounds wrong to say, for example, it's sometimes the case that 2 and 2 makes 4. Right? Is it true that it's sometimes the case that 2 and 2 makes 4? Philosophers like Fine will say, no, it's not. That is an ill-formed, in fact, Fine goes so far as to say it's a meaningless sentence. He says we shouldn't be so prejudiced as to think that you can combine any expression like it's sometimes the case with any old sentence to form a meaningful sentence. Just like you shouldn't think that the number 3 is red, he says, is a meaningful sentence just because you can combine the predicate is red with the name, the number 3. And that gives some kind of motivation for the view. However, it's also easy, and this is my great worry about relying strongly on Fine's, after all, kind of intuitive judgment about this distinction between these different kinds of propositions, to deny this premise, which is that it's really easy, it seems to me, to imagine an explanation for why a sentence like sometimes 2 and 2 makes 4 would sound odd, despite being meaningful and true. And that is that, for example, in ordinary conversational contexts, when we say something is sometimes the case, we usually presuppose or imply or convey somehow, in many contexts at least, that it's sometimes not the case. And I think that's partly why it sounds so odd to speak in a temporal way about mathematics, is because it's a given that we don't expect the maths to change, right? So we never say, it's always, we never have to insist that it's always the case that 2 and 2 makes 4. And we never have to say, from which it follows that it's sometimes the case that 2 and 2 makes 4. It was 2 and 2, and 2 and 2 made 4 on Tuesday, and also on Wednesday. We don't usually have to specify. And that's why it sounds so odd. Now, if any such explanation for the oddness, I think what people in semantics call the infelicitousness, right? The experience of oddness that we have when we hear that sentence as speakers of the language, then if any other such explanation works, I think it undercuts Fine's distinction in a pretty dramatic way, because after all it's a metaphysical hypothesis and therefore comes at some cost. If we can explain the motivating intuition or judgment by reference to facts about our psychology or semantics, it would seem a much less costly price to pay. So those, I think, are the two crucial premises of the argument, and now I'll wrap it up. That to say that something is sometimes true is to say it's true at a time, and vice versa, and that what's always true is true, or, if you like, what's true is sometimes true. In order to get the equivalence between what's always true is true and what's true is sometimes true, we just need to accept this, that what's sometimes not true, what's sometimes not the case, is what's not always the case. So if I'm sometimes not happy, then I'm not always happy, and vice versa. That seems like a perfectly sensible thing to accept. And then another slightly heavy-duty assumption that there must be a truth. No matter how things turned out, there would be a truth. So to take the limiting case, suppose there were no truths for reductio, there would be a truth that there were no truths, and so there has to be a truth. Okay. So no matter how things turn out, something has to be true. Okay. So putting these together, we get the result that putting 2, 3, and 4 together, 2 being that what's the case, what's always the case is the case, we get the conclusion that there must be something that's sometimes true. Right. So from all these individually reasonable sounding things, we've now got already a kind of quite surprising conclusion. No matter how things turned out, something would be sometimes true. Right. Even if we were living in just a world of mathematics, there would be truths that are sometimes true. Right? 2 and 2 makes 4 would be sometimes true. They'd be sometimes true because they were always true. And so then finally applying the equivalence of sometimes and there is a time according to which we get the conclusion that no matter how things turn out, something is true at a time, and therefore that there is a time. Because of course, if it has to be that something is true at a time, then there has to be a time for that to be true. So what's going on here? What's the space of reactions and space of options? I think to summarize, very briefly, this argument is going to put pressure on your view of time as whether you think it's a purely physical phenomenon, I think, or whether you think it's something non-physical, effectively. However, I think it could also put pressure on people who do think of time as a non-physical thing, something that, a metaphysical phenomenon, as it were, in some sense. I don't like that way of putting it, but I just want to make the distinction. Because they might be very wedded to the view that, you know, there could be, at least in principle, a world of pure mathematics that had no time in it. There could be an atemporal world, somehow. So, here's the view that falls out of accepting the conclusion of this argument, which I'm not sure, I mean, I don't know if I agree with it, but I can see the attraction, that it doesn't matter how things turn out. There's always at least one moment of time. The one moment of time that there would be if we lived in a world of pure mathematics would just be the truth, the conjoined truth of everything that is, right? Just the truth that encompasses everything. It would be, even a maths world would be a world like the one I described at the start, of one time and everything always being true, right? And no matter how, so even if Barber is correct, even if Rovelli is correct, well, Rovelli's confused, even if Barber is correct, confused about the philosophy, even if quantum loop gravity is true, even if some other theory is true of the reconciliation, there will be at least a single moment of time that is the truth that encompasses everything. There'll be an eternal world. That's if you're the kind of person who thinks those worlds are unchanging worlds, at least. That's the kind of view I think that comes from this. Okay, I'll finish there. Sorry, that was probably longer than.
Questions?
Yes. Oh, sorry. I did it again. I tried to introduce myself too.
I was wondering about a sort of slightly more more concessive response to the fine worry.
Yeah.
So, could you argue that even if you accept that there are some eternal truths, there are always going to be non-eternal truths? I'm not sure how you do it in general, but
yeah.
I mean, if you kind of worry cases where there's only mathematics,
yeah.
if you think that it's possible that there may have been concrete things,
yeah.
isn't the truth that there are no concrete things a non-eternal truth in such a world?
Yeah, yeah. Yes, yes. You might think it's possible. Sorry, is it temporary? No, it's not temporary.
So from the perspective of the world where there's only maths,
yeah, okay, yeah.
It seems to be true that there's nothing that is concrete.
Yes, yes.
But
and there's never anything that's concrete.
And there's never anything that's concrete. But isn't that truth? That's not an eternal truth. Sorry, it's always true, but it's not an eternal truth in fine sense.
Oh yes, it's not because it's not a truth about from the outside. Yeah, that's right. Does it help?
Well, I thought your worry was that maybe the only truths are eternal truths, and so although there are truths, it doesn't follow that they're that there's a time at which they're true.
Yeah. But
I'm thinking that the truth that there is nothing concrete is true at.
It's true at the one time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, if the only bar to your principle one was that P might be an eternal truth, then even if there are such truths, if there are always if necessarily there are.
Yeah. then finds
Also
thing doesn't
non-eternal
happen.
truth.
Yeah. So that's bad news for the Feinian response. Yeah, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought of that. There could have been.
Sorry. Just
Sorry.
no.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
Just very quick. Why do we think that in this mathematical world that the other concrete objects can't itself be internal truth in one sense?
Well, I thought the sort of intuitive gloss was that these eternal truths aren't a matter of how things are at any time there is, but there being nothing concrete does seem to be about how the times are if there are times. But at the time.
Yeah, it cares. Like I tried to put my best gloss on it. The content cares about what's located within the time. And so, if you grant that the mathematical world is a world of a single mathematical time, as it were, an eternal, frozen mathematical time, you might think the truth that there are no concrete things does care about what's happening at that one time. It cares that there are no concrete things.
But you shouldn't say that it's a world where there is just one mathematical time, right? But that's begging the question, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, it is. But I'm trying to. I mean, I think the Feinian distinction is not so clear cut that you can.
Yeah, maybe that's kind of the problem.
Yeah. I mean, if you could, yeah. Sorry, yeah, I think it's really interesting though. Thanks, Alan. Really interesting. Really, yeah. Cool.
Yeah, I think that something I didn't quite get about your discussion of this argument for necessary temporality.
Yeah.
You didn't discuss the first premise, did you? Did you question it?
Not deeply. No,
Yeah.
I didn't.
So
I focused on the premise too.
I was thinking it could be taken to be the contrary, right? So I'm thinking of someone like Arthur Pryor, taking the tensor operators as primitive, and who would deny the existence of time. So the idea would be, well, yes, we can talk about temporal reality, but all we have is really these operators. Now it turns out that Pryor constructs the times as maximum propositions or something like that. But suppose take someone like Pryor, but unlike him in this other respect. So perhaps because they don't, they don't like propositional identification, for instance. So they would actually they would deny a lot of the argument because it's all framed in terms of this for all P for C and so on and so forth. But I was thinking that someone like that could resist one way or another, perhaps specifically by rejecting the first premise or something like the first premise, or perhaps rejecting other parts of the argument.
Yeah.
Because they are framed in terms of identifiers. So what do you think here?
I'm not. It's a good question. It's something I wrestled with a bit in thinking about, because I'm trying. I'm going to write a paper around. This is the kernel of the paper, and I've tended to frame everything, as you can tell, in terms of philosophers who think there are, in some sense or other, moments of time. I had thought a bit about the kind of philosopher who says there aren't moments of time. There are just truths about there's just what's always true and sometimes true, and was a kind of presentist you might get from Pryor without knowing that, as you said, that he had this other kind of view. I suppose I'm so used to thinking that that you can I'm used to thinking of time as a role, just it's a role to be played by something or other, defined by certain basic principles about what's the case at, and so the kinds of things can be true at and so on, right? That would give you the sort of normal basic, whatever the most basic tense logic you need is. And I'm used to thinking that if that's what times are, and you didn't think that time was a physical phenomenon, I mean, you didn't think that times themselves were physical. That's a much better way of putting it. I'm really sorry for putting it like that during the talk, because that was terrible. Hope it's not recorded. Is it recorded? No.
It's recorded. We can edit a few things.
We'll fix it first. Sorry. Okay, good. I'm used to thinking that you just can't avoid there being times in that priorian sense. I don't think you need to accept that this primitivism about quantification at all. I think, you'd have to be someone who think, well, I mean, who is this person? They think there are no propositions. Is that what they think? Yeah, and I'm not sure I think we live in different life worlds, me and that person, to some extent. But it is it's a way out. And they might say, yes, I can imagine, no, you're right, no. To be fair, okay, I mean, to that kind of philosopher, yeah. I'm a really old-fashioned presentist. I have no truck with this nonsense about constructing times for some, let's imagine, goodish reason. And of course there could be no times at all. If there was no physical world, for example, then there just would, not only, normally there are no times, they might even say. Are they someone who thinks there's always at least one time that's constantly being replaced? That's the interesting question. They might even be someone who agrees with MacTaggart, right? That there is no time, in my sense of no time. I'd say, there are no moments of time. By your thesis, there's no time. And even if they think that there's only one moment of time, there's constantly, a single bubble that's constantly being renewed, then they might say that could easily fail to be around. They'll be much more like the physicalist about time. As I say, of course, the physics of the world could have been such that no such bubble could be formed or whatever. Maybe. Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I need to think more about that kind of person. I think I need to give them more due. I'm getting too used to this way.
We're going to take 5 minutes over time.
Yeah, of course.
It's a bit late. You wanted to follow up?
Yes, because I think you're speaking to like my presuppositions, so I can represent them really.
Better than I can anyway.
It seems to me that you have passed from the example of nihilism, which maybe could be a strong objection, to the mathematics objection, which is also good, but maybe not as strong as the nihilistic case.
Yeah.
Suppose I am a nominalist.
Yes.
I don't think there are mathematical objects.
Yes.
And especially I don't think there are propositions.
Yes.
I don't need to be a nominalist for that.
No.
Mind doesn't believe in propositions. The only things there are true are sentences. So if there is nothing physical or nothing at all, there are no sentences. So your premise that nothing is that something is true is false, because there is sentences and nothing to be true. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this. Yeah. So I thought you were. Of course, we could go in the other extreme direction. There's also a kind of nihilist who might say. I mean, there is a kind of nihilist who will also say. So let's take the two extremes. This is good. So we need to think about nihilism. On the one hand, you've got the kind of nihilism that you mentioned, or the possibility of the kind of nihilism. It's possible nihilism, it's not nihilism. The sort of Quinian of objects and sets of objects and nominalism and sentences and, you strip away the physical world, there's nothing, there's nothing left, and there's really nothing left. Is that right? Is that the kind of view? Yeah. And it's not that there's any, there's no possibility there once you've stripped away the physical world. There's no such possibility. Okay. And so there's no interesting case to consider. And then on the other hand, you've got your kind of nihilist who says, in fact, the physical world is itself not deeply physical, right? Who says objects, what you think of as objects, are really constructions from sets which can be represented using quantification into predicate position, And then you can talk about those using propositional quantification. And in fact, we could build the whole world up in its entirety from the basis of there being no things at all. So this is the sort of reverse, the most unQuinian Quine. Right? This is the Quines, you know, in Superman, there's Bizarro Superman. This is Bizarro Quine, right? There are no things. All we need is higher order quantification. So the views the arguments I'm describing, the argument I describe will be unpersuasive to both of those people. It'll be unpersuasive to the proper Quinian, to Superman, because there's no such possibility to consider as to there's no possibility where there's one time, because there's either a physical world or there isn't. And you might think of one, I mean, certainly it's possible for there to be no time, let's put it like that. And on the other hand, you've got the person who says, even if there were nothing concrete, in fact there is nothing concrete, they say. And there are many times. So the worry, the possibility of there being nothing concrete is in no way entails or suggests that there might not be time. It really speaks to our. What I like about this is that this question is that I think anyway it speaks to a part of philosophy of time that we don't always consider, which is how flexible. Whatever we think time and change are, how flexible are we in terms of what we think they could be? And I just think there's like a little bit less discussion. We think about whether there is time or there isn't a bit, but we don't usually think about how much we can push our own notions of time. And whether, for example, we would think, like, do we think time might be ambiguous, not just, so, do we think that when we talk about time in the philosophy of time, we're always consistently talking about the same things? I mean, even individually that we're always talking about the same things. I don't know if even that might be true. Sorry, yeah. Thank you.
Okay, please join me in thanking Dan.